Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1991. A city proud of its nickname, the City of Friendliness, a community that for years was defined by its working-class heritage, its quiet neighborhoods, its factories, its street festivals, and that appearance of normalcy that so characterized the American Midwest. It was a place where families knew each other by name, where neighbors still exchanged greetings on porches, and where life seemed to pass at a slow, predictable, almost routine pace. But beneath that serene facade existed a completely different reality for some of its inhabitants. Poverty, racial discrimination, silent violence, and a lack of social resources made certain neighborhoods worlds apart within the same city. And it was precisely in one of those underprivileged neighborhoods where one of the most disturbing stories in modern criminology began. For over a decade, a shadow advanced with surgical precision through the cracks of that urban landscape, unhurried, without real obstacles, without raising suspicion. It operated from an ordinary apartment, a space that went unnoticed at 213 North 25th Street. It was no larger or louder than the others. It was not distinguished by anything in particular. It was simply another unit in a dilapidated building, inhabited by people who mostly struggled day to day to get by. And yet, that small apartment would become one of the scenes of the deepest horror in contemporary American history. Its occupant was Jeffrey Dahmer, a man whose appearance did not attract attention. Blonde, tall, shy, with a slow and almost childish way of speaking. His neighbors described him as someone quiet, polite, even helpful at times. It seems incredible to think that this individual, who worked the night shift at a chocolate factory and barely interacted with others, was hiding a parallel life that defied any human explanation. Behind that bland image lay absolute chaos. Dahmer had been immersed in chronic alcoholism since adolescence, and in his isolation had built his own world, full of obsessive fantasies that over time became indescribable acts. The nauseating smell emanating from his apartment was a constant for months. Neighbors complained, sought explanations, but Dahmer always had a prepared response. The meat spoiled, my fish died, the refrigerator broke down. And although he never fully convinced anyone, no one imagined what was really happening inside. Behind that door lay an authentic chamber of torture and dismemberment. There were surgical instruments, chemicals, containers with corrosive substances, and a collection of human remains preserved in multiple ways. Over time, those horrors would turn into undeniable evidence of what Dahmer was capable of doing. But this case is not just the story of a killer. It is also a dark reflection of the failures of the social, police, and judicial system in the United States. Dahmer's story is closely linked to police negligence, institutional indifference, and above all, racial and social prejudices that allowed his crimes to spread over more than 13 years. Throughout that time there were signals, there were opportunities, there were moments when someone could have intervened. But no one did. Dahmer's victims were mostly young gay men, men of color, vulnerable individuals who lived on the margins of society. Dahmer knew perfectly well whom he chose. He approached them in bars and malls at bus stops. He offered them money or alcohol in exchange for photographs, companionship, or sexual favors. His choice was not casual. He sought those he knew would be ignored. People whose disappearances would not trigger major investigations, whose voices would carry less weight if they reported abuses. Dahmer had inadvertently studied the system's flaws and exploited them with chilling precision. Once inside the apartment, reality transformed into nightmare. Dahmer resorted to sedation to completely nullify his victims. The goal was simple and terrifying: to obtain absolute companionship, total obedience, a presence that he could manipulate, possess, and keep even beyond death. To achieve this, he not only killed, he performed post-mortem acts that revealed a pathological obsession with control. Dismemberment, preservation of remains, photographing bodies in specific poses. Each crime was a macabre elaboration of a fantasy that repeated itself with an almost ritual pattern. The 213 became a museum of Dahmer's personal horror. When the police finally entered that apartment, after years of inaction, they discovered evidence that seemed taken from a horror movie. Polaroids of bodies in various stages of mutilation, skulls carefully cleaned and stored in a filing cabinet as if they were trophies. human heads in the refrigerator, a heart in the freezer ready to be consumed later, and a barrel containing remains dissolved in acid. Reality surpassed any fiction, and yet the most chilling aspect was not just what Dahmer did, but how he was able to do it for so long. El caso de Canaric Synthesymphone, que ocurrió justo meses antes de la detención final, es el ejemplo más brutal de la negligencia policial. Canaric, un niño de 14 años, logró escapar de Dahmer completamente desnudo, drogado, en un estado de shock. Tres mujeres vecinas en el edificio lo encontraron y llamaron a la policía. Pidieron por ayuda. El niño apenas podía hablar, pero estaba claro que necesitaba asistencia inmediata. Cuando los oficiales llegaron, Dahmer apareció y, con impresionante calma, explicó que era una disputa doméstica entre dos amantes adultos. Los oficiales, ignorando la evidente edad del niño, desestimaron las preocupaciones de los testigos y, impulsados por prejuicios raciales y homofobia, la entregaron directamente al asesino. Minutos más tarde, Canaric sería asesinado dentro del apartamento. That decision, which cost an innocent life, became the perfect symbol of the institutional blindness that allowed Dahmer to act with total impunity. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer is, therefore, much more than a series of murders. It is a portrait of two parallel tragedies, the extreme cruelty of an individual and the structural failure of a system that was supposed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The story of the so-called Milwaukee monster not only speaks to us of the evil that can exist just a few feet away from us, but also of the evil that arises when society, due to prejudice, indifference, or incompetence, did not unfold amid beatings, explicit abuse, or devastating misery, as occurs in many criminal profiles, but it was deeply marked by an unstable, silent, and corrosive emotional atmosphere. A home where screams were not always visible, but were constant, where the emotional distance was so great that it would end up shaping the worldview of an extraordinarily vulnerable child. Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, and from his early years, he lived in an environment that, while not violently traumatic, was infused with tensions, illnesses, absences, and conflicts that pushed him toward loneliness. His parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, maintained a fragile marriage, full of arguments, resentments, and intense emotional episodes. Joyce suffered from depressive episodes, severe anxiety, and dependencies on various prescription medications, rendering her unstable and distant. Lionel, for his part, was focused on his studies and later on his career as a chemist, which kept him away from home for endless hours. Thus, Jeffrey grew up in a context where emotional attention was scarce and where his emotional needs went unnoticed. His inner world became filled with uncomfortable silences, isolation, and a progressive disconnection from social reality. One of the most significant elements of his childhood was the seemingly innocent influence of his father. Lionel, apasionado por la química y la ciencia, trató en varias ocasiones de conectar con su hijo a través de experimentos y actividades educativas. Una de esas actividades implicaba recoger animales muertos de la carretera para enseñar a Jeffrey cómo se decomponían los cuerpos, cómo se podían limpiar los huesos con químicos, y cómo funcionaban ciertos procesos de disección. Para cualquier otro niño, eso habría sido un peculiar ejercicio científico. Para Jeffrey, era una puerta abierta. Una validación. Una forma de darle sentido a una oscura curiosidad que ya se agolpaba dentro de él. Desde muy joven, exhibió comportamientos que preocupaban a quienes lo rodeaban. Era extremadamente introvertido. Evitaba el contacto visual. Hablaba poco y no mostraba interés en las relaciones sociales. En la escuela, rara vez participaba, y su vida académica se desarrollaba al margen de los otros estudiantes. A lo largo de los años, comenzó a coleccionar huesos de animales, almacenándolos, clasificándolos, limpiándolos con productos corrosivos, e incluso jugando con ellos. El sonido de los huesos chocando entre si la resultaba satisfactorio, como más tarde declararía. Reprodujo, con inquietante precisión, los métodos de conservación que su padre le había enseñado, pero los aplicó con una fascinación que iba más allá del interés científico. Esta temprana obsesión con la anatomía, la muerte y la conservación de restos biológicos fue el primer síntoma claro de lo que estaba por venir. Lo que inicialmente se centró en animales, eventualmente se fusionó con sus fantasías sexuales durante la adolescencia. Jeffrey comenzó a imaginar cuerpos inmóviles, figuras sumisas, personas completamente bajo su control. Sus deseos se mezclaron con la fantasía de tener compañía sin la posibilidad de abandono, una fantasía nacida de un profundo miedo a la soledad y el rechazo. A medida que Jeffrey crecía, su vida familiar comenzó a colapsar. Los conflictos entre Lionel y Joyce se intensificaron, volviéndose cada vez más destructivos. La atmósfera en casa era tan tensa que Jeffrey comenzó a consumir alcohol siendo apenas un adolescente. Para él, el alcohol no era entretenimiento, era un anestésico emocional. Era el mecanismo que le permitía silenciar sus pensamientos, su ansiedad, su torpeza social y, paradójicamente, las fantasías que empezaban a dominarlo. El punto crítico llegó cuando sus padres decidieron divorciarse. Fue una separación conflictiva, ruidosa y caótica. Joyce dejó la casa levandos al hermano menor de Jeffrey, dejando al joven completamente solo durante meses. A los 18 años, Dahmer fue abandonado en una casa aislada, sin supervisión, sin compañía, sin estructura familiar. Una mezcla perfecta para que sus impulsos reprimidos encontraran el momento exacto para salir a la luz. Su alcoholismo se intensificó, sus fantasías se volvieron más vividas, y su sentido de aislamiento se transformó en una desesperada necesidad de controlar y poser. Fue entonces cuando todo explotó. En el verano de 1978, solo unas semanas después de su graduación de secundaria, Jeffrey cometió su primer asesinato. Vio a un joven autoestopista, Stephen Hicks, caminando por la carretera. Lo invitó a la casa familiar aprovechando el hecho de que estaba solo. Bebron hablaron, y cuando Hicks quiso algo en Dahmer se rompió. El miedo de estar solo, el pánico al abandono, la mezcla de alcohol y fantasía llevó a Dahmer a golpearlo con un mancuerna y luego asfixiarlo. Ese primer homicidio fue impulsivo, torpe, caótico, pero reveló una verdad esencial. Dahmer no estaba matando por ira, sino por posesión. No quería que Hicks se fuera. Quería que se quedara para siempre. Lo que sucedió después confirmó la magnitud de su perturbación. Dahmer permaneció días con el cadáver, desmembrándolo pacientemente, limpiando los huesos en ácido, y enterrando los restos en el jardín. No había prisa. No había remordimientos. En cambio, había una sensación de control total sobre un cuerpo, sobre una presencia. Ese patrón, la combinación de muerte, manipulación, desmembramiento y preservación parcial, sería la marca inconfundible de su modus operandi en los años siguientes. Sorprendentemente, después del asesinato de Hicks, Jeffrey intentó llevar una vida normal. Intentó estudiar en la Universidad Estatal de Ohio, pero su adicción al alcohol lo sumió en el fracaso. Lionel, desesperado, lo inscribió en el ejército. Dahmer logró quedarse un tiempo, pero el alcohol y su incapacidad para seguir reglas estrictas llevaron a su expulsión. Después de su baja, pasó por Florida y eventualmente regresó a Milwaukee, viviendo con su abuela, que representaba para él la última figura familiar relativamente estable que le quedaba. Entre 1978 y 1987, hubo un largo periodo sin crímenes conocidos. Pero no fue una pausa moral. Fue una acumulación. Dahmer continuó bebiendo, continuó fantaseando, continuó buscando control en otras áreas de su vida. Sus impulsos no habían desaparecido, simplemente aguardaban circunstancias más favorables. Y cuando esas circunstancias surgieron, una ciudad más grande, más anonimato, más oportunidades para cazar víctimas vulnerables, la semilla que había estado creciendo durante una década floreció en el patrón asesino que lo convirtió en uno de los asesinos en serie más Milwaukee in the late 1980s. Jeffrey Dahmer found in his grandmother's house a refuge that not only provided a roof over his head, but also a facade of normalcy. On the surface, the figure of a protective grandmother transformed him into a young man with a structured, family-oriented, and calm life. For Dahmer, this facade was perfect. It shielded him from suspicion and allowed him to continue silently building his inner world, a world where fantasies of absolute control had already taken deep root. However, the presence of his grandmother did not prevent Dahmer from beginning to act methodically. On the contrary, it forced him to refine his ability to conceal and plan each step. Dahmer's downward spiral began to accelerate in 1987. This year marked the start of his sustained period of activity, when the ideas, impulses, and fantasies he had been nurturing for years reached its most critical and painful point, not with one of his planned murders, but with one of the most embarrassing and devastating moments for the Milwaukee police. An episode that, over time, became the ultimate symbol of negligence, incompetence, and institutional prejudices in the United States. On May 27, 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Coneric Synthesymphone had the most improbable and valuable opportunity that anyone in Dahmer's hands could have: to escape. But that opportunity was snatched away, not by the killer, but by the police themselves, who returned him directly to his executioner. Coneric had been drugged, subjected, and attacked by Dahmer. The killer had attempted to carry out one of his most monstrous experiments, drilling into his victim's skull to inject substances intended to destroy part of his brain and leave him in a state of permanent obedience. And yet, amidst that horror, the young boy managed to muster the little strength he had left to flee from apartment 213. He stumbled out, naked, injured, bleeding from the head, barely able to articulate any words, completely disoriented. It was an image impossible to ignore. A nearly unconscious boy wandering down North 25th Street, asking for help without being able to speak. In a twist that seemed like a breath within the tragedy, Coneric was seen by 3 African-American women, Sandra Smith, Glenda Cleveland, and Glenda's daughter. They did not look away. They did not assume it was someone else's problem. They approached, tried to cover him, attempted to calm him, gave him water, and asked what had happened. He understood almost nothing of what they were saying, but his terror was evident. The women saw he was a child, saw that the wound on his head was serious, saw that he was so drugged he could not even stand. And while they tried to protect him, Jeffrey Dahmer appeared. Dahmer entered the scene with a nearly theatrical calmness, as if nothing about it were strange. He approached, smiled, tried to touch the young man to take him away. He said, without hesitation, that Coneric was his 23-year-old lover. That they were drunk. That they had had a domestic dispute. He tried to control the situation with the same manipulative calm that had kept him unpunished for years. But this time, the women were not fooled. They did not believe a single word. The smell emanating from Dahmer was nauseating, a mix of alcohol, chemicals, and something else that none could identify, but which immediately repulsed them. And it wasn't just the smell. It was the cold, distant, dehumanized attitude. Coneric tried to get away from him, even though he could barely move. Glenda Cleveland called 911. She explained that a child was in danger. That he needed medical help. That he was underage. That something was not right. that a strange man was trying to take him away by force, and while the women tried to prevent Dahmer from taking him, police officers arrived. The Milwaukee officers who responded were John Balcerzik and Joseph Gabrish. From the very first moment, they demonstrated a disdainful, indifferent attitude, colored by prejudice. They did not see a child. They did not see a victim. What they saw was a domestic issue between gays, something that, in their homophobic and racist mentality, simply did not deserve much attention. Konarek, sedated and unable to speak English fluently, could not defend himself or explain what was happening. Even so, his physical state was evident. Visible injuries, incoherence, tremors, nudity, inability to stand. None of these signs alarmed the officers. Despite the desperate pleas of the African American women, who insisted again and again that the young man appeared to be under 15, that he needed a hospital, that Dahmer was lying, the officers did absolutely nothing. They did not ask for identification. They did not call paramedics. They did not verify the boy's age. They did not inspect the apartment, even though Dahmer invited them to make sure everything was all right. When Dahmer opened his door, the officers smelled the pungent odor coming from inside. But still, they accepted the explanation that the refrigerator was broken. The officers even laughed. One of them, while walking away, radioed a cruel phrase that would be recorded. "Back to patrol, we return them to their boyfriend." What they delivered was not an adult to his partner. It was a drugged child to a killer. It was an innocent life handed over to death. Minutes after the police left, Dahmer killed Konarek. He was victim number 12. The tragedy became even more unbearable when it was revealed that the Synthasymphone family had already had prior contact with Dahmer. In 1988, Konarek's older brother, Somsak Synthasymphone, had been sexually assaulted by the same man. Dahmer had been convicted for it. The system already knew who he was. There had already been a warning. There was already a history. But no one monitored him. No one supervised him. No one considered him a risk. The child who escaped in 1991 was returned by the police to the same individual who had abused his own brother years earlier. When Dahmer's crimes were uncovered weeks later, the Konarek case became a social earthquake. The outrage was national. The Milwaukee Police Department was criticized for racism, homophobia, negligence, and a total lack of professionalism. Chief Ariala initially defended his officers, but public pressure was so immense that an internal investigation was opened. Balcerzik and Gabrish were fired, although years later they would be reinstated after an appeal, a fact that many considered a new slap in the face to the community and to Konarek's memory. The Konarek case not only exposed Dahmer's monstrosity. It showed the other side of horror, the passive complicity of a system that did not protect the vulnerable, who did not want to see, who did not want to hear. It was the ultimate proof that in Milwaukee not all lives were valued equally. For Dahmer, institutional silence was his best accomplice. For Konarek, it was the death sentence. Jeffrey Dahmer lasted for more than a decade, hidden behind a facade of normalcy and silence. But all that accumulated horror ended in the most unexpected way. Not due to a deep investigation, not through a police operation, not by the action of a system that had been failing for years, but thanks to the desperate courage of a man who refused to die. Tracy Edwards, the last identified victim of Dahmer, was the one who, with a mix of ingenuity, resilience, and pure survival instinct, managed to escape from apartment 213 and bring down forever the wall of impunity that protected the killer. Tracy Edwards was 32 years old, an African-American man, sociable, used to moving around the bars of Milwaukee. On the night of July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached him with the same strategy he had used dozens of times before. A money offer, companionship, drinks, an apparently harmless invitation. Edwards agreed to go with him, not realizing he was entering the rabbit hole from which so many others had never emerged. Upon crossing the apartment door, the atmosphere hit him immediately. The dense, sour, indescribable smell, the dark and messy room, the fan running to dissipate a stench that no incense could hide. At first the conversation was vague, even trivial. Dahmer seemed shy, almost withdrawn, but something in his gaze betrayed a strange tension, a constant unease. While offering him drinks, Dahmer manipulated objects, looked at the door with excessive frequency, and observed every movement of Edwards with a disturbing intensity. Suddenly, the situation changed. Dahmer played strange dark music and without warning pulled out handcuffs. He took Edwards' wrist and closed one of the cuffs around it. The other one didn't quite latch. Then he pulled out a knife. His voice, calm but empty, assured him that he wouldn't hurt him if he behaved well. In that moment, Edwards understood that he was in real danger. Dahmer's faded smile, his irregular breathing, his insistence that Edwards pose for photographs under improvised lights, all indicated that he was facing a predator who had no intention of letting him leave alive. But unlike other victims, Edwards kept a cool head. He decided not to confront him directly. He talked to him. He listened. He asked questions. He tried to appear cooperative while keeping an eye out for the opportunity to escape. It was a tense, hours-long conversation, during which Dahmer fluctuated between calm and contained violence. At a crucial moment, Edwards asked Dahmer to go to the bathroom. He said it casually, as a basic need. Dahmer hesitated, but ultimately agreed. He had to help him unbuckle his belt, because he was still handcuffed to one wrist. In that minimal distraction, in that fraction of a second when Dahmer's absolute control loosened just a bit, Edwards acted. He gathered all his strength, dealt a direct blow to Dahmer's face, and ran toward the door. Dahmer tried to stop him, chased him. There was a struggle in the hallway, but Edwards, driven by pure fear, managed to break free and escape outside, with the handcuffs still hanging from his wrist as proof of the hell he had just fled. He ran down the street in desperation, and luck, the luck that so many victims before him had not had, led him to cross paths with two police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Muller. Breathless, terrified, he begged for help. He showed them the handcuff. He explained that a man had tried to kill him. This time, unlike what happened with Canaric Synthasymphone, the officers listened. Something in Edwards' expression, in his tone, in his gaze, made them understand that this was not an exaggeration. The officers accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213. Dahmer greeted them calmly, with that coldness that had deceived so many police officers before. He asserted that it was all a misunderstanding, that it was simply a disagreement between adults. It was the same strategy as always, the same smooth voice, the same rehearsed lies. But Edwards was not drugged, nor confused, nor intimidated. With full clarity, he pointed to a nightstand. He said there was evidence there. Officer Muller approached, opened the drawer, and found the horror. Inside was a collection of Polaroid photographs showing mutilated, posed, dismembered bodies. They were images so explicit and so impossible to justify that within seconds, the mask of normalcy that Dahmer had been holding up for years completely crumbled. Officer Routh stepped back, completely shocked. Muller, without hesitating, took Dahmer by the arm and handcuffed him. Dahmer, far from denying anything, simply said, "This is all real." With that phrase, the truth came to light. The monster had been discovered. The Milwaukee nightmare was coming to an end. Tracy Edwards' escape was not just an act of survival. It was a heroic act. His bravery allowed the world to know the extent of the horror that lay behind the door of that apartment. It also ironically exposed that Dahmer's downfall was due to the courage of a victim, not to the efficacy of a police system that had ignored clear signs for years. With his determination, Edwards changed the story. He saved his life and in a way also saved those who could have been the next victims of Dahmer. The monster was caught that night, but only because a terrified man decided he was not Jeffrey Dahmer. In apartment 213 on North 25th Street was described by the agents themselves as one of the most chilling scenes recorded in the criminal history of the United States. The place where Dahmer had lived for months was, in reality, a sanctuary of horror that had gone unnoticed right under the authorities' noses. And that night, after apprehending the killer, agents Robert Routh and Rolf Muller crossed that door again, this time with the certainty that what they were about to find would far exceed the Polaroids they had already uncovered. They quickly confirmed their worst suspicions. The smell was the first thing that hit them. An unbearable, dense, almost physical stench composed of decomposing flesh, corrosive chemicals, bleach, dried blood, and something else, something none of the agents had ever smelled before. They realized that the excuse of a broken refrigerator was not just a lie from Dahmer. It was a symptom of a much bigger horror. Every corner of the apartment seemed permeated by that smell. There was no way to ignore it. The first mandatory stop was the photographs. The Polaroids had already revealed the soul of the apartment, but now the agents saw it in full light. In the bedroom, on the nightstand, in drawers, stacked in folders, they found dozens of images taken by Dahmer. They were not casual photographs. Each one documented a specific moment of Dahmer's personal ritual: bodies before and after death, macabre poses, clean cuts, progressive dismemberments, headless torsos, preserved heads, limbs arranged with precision. These images were not mere documentation. They were objects of contemplation for Dahmer. Trophies that allowed him to relive over and over again the exact moment he had complete control over another human being. But that, as grotesque as it was only the surface. In the kitchen, the agents began to inspect the refrigerator. They opened it cautiously and found a human head, perfectly cut, carefully washed, and wrapped in a bag. The eyes closed, the recognizable features. It was impossible to look at it without grasping the extent of Dahmer's obsession. In the freezer, they found packages wrapped with surgical precision, as if they were meat bought at a supermarket. Inside those packages were organs, muscles, human tissue ready for consumption. Dahmer had later acknowledged that he did not eat those remains out of hunger, but because he felt that this way his victims became part of him. The scene in the bedroom was even more disturbing. There is where the agents found the filing cabinet where Dahmer kept his most prized trophies. Skulls carefully bleached, with a cleanliness so pristine that they seemed to belong to a university lab. A nearly complete skeleton lay in a corner, ready to be assembled. There were hands, preserved genitals, loose bones wrapped in bags. Each fragment told a story. Each piece was the tangible testimony of a life snatched away. The magnitude of Dahmer's pathology became evident with each discovery. He was not an impulsive killer. He was someone who dedicated time, planning, and precision to preserving parts of his victims. He was the physical representation of his need for total possession, beyond life, beyond death. When the agents continued the inspection, they came to a place that was equally horrifying: the building's basement. Dahmer had used it on several occasions for his process of disposing of remains. There they found an industrial barrel filled with hydrochloric acid. Inside floated human parts in various states of dissolution. It was the method with which Dahmer tried to erase evidence, a procedure he had already begun with his first victim in 1978, when he discovered that acid could break down flesh and leave bones clean. While all this was happening in the apartment, Dahmer was at the police station, beginning a confession that left even the most experienced officers stunned. His voice showed no remorse, no emotion, no attempt at justification. He explained with clinical coldness how he drugged his victims, how he drilled their skulls to try to create obedient zombies, how he dismembered the bodies, and how he consumed parts of them. He spoke of each name, from Stephen Hicks in 1978 to his failed attempt with Tracy Edwards in 1991. He described step by step his methodology, his rituals, his impulses, and the exact order of each murder. The forensic investigation that followed was one of the most complex ever conducted in Wisconsin. There were human remains in different states, mixed, tagged, and distributed throughout the apartment. Experts had to work for weeks, comparing fragments with reports of missing persons. Each identification was another devastating confirmation. And among the names that appeared in the reports, one resonated with particular force: Canaric synthasomphone. The Milwaukee police had been in that apartment 2 months before, but they had let him live. That was a wound that would never heal. Apartment 213 was not just a crime scene. It was a mirror that showed all the horror that Dahmer had accumulated, and at the same time, reflected the deep cracks in the system that allowed that horror to exist. It was the definitive proof of the killer's monstrosity, and the negligence of those who should have stopped him much earlier. A place where the smell, the objects, the remains, and the photographs told a story that could no longer be began in 1992. Why inmediatamente se convirtió en un fenómeno mediático internacional. Un espectáculo macabro que mezclaba horror, curiosidad morbosa. Y una necesidad colectiva de entender, como alguien podría cometer tales crímenes aberrantes, sin ser atrapado durante tantos años. La parte sorprendente no era la culpabilidad. Dahmer lo había admitido sin resistencia desde el principio. Lo que estaba en juego. Y lo que transformó este juicio en una confrontación histórica. Era su estado mental. La pregunta que todos querían responder era si Jeffrey Dahmer actuó como un monstruo consciente o como una persona enferma mentalmente incapaz de distinguir el bien del mal. Dahmer enfrentó 15 cargos de asesinato en primer grado. Sus abogados defensores, liderados por Gerald Boyle, sabían que la evidencia era abrumadora. No había escape. Lo único que podría salvar a Dahmer de una condena a cadena perpetua era convencer al jurado de que no era legalmente responsable de sus acciones debido a una enfermedad mental severa. Boyle presentó la defensa de no culpabilidad por razón de locura. Un argumento arriesgado. Pero la única carta disponible. La defensa argumentó que Dahmer no actuaba con plena capacidad racional, sino que estaba impulsado por parafilias extremas y un profundo trastorno psicológico. Discutieron la necrofilia, la pedofilia, el trastorno límite de la personalidad. Y fantasías delirantes que lo desconectaban de la realidad. Según la defensa, su obsesión por crear zombies no era una expresión de maldad, sino la prueba de una mente completamente rota. Pero la fiscalía no estaba dispuesta a dejar que Dahmer se ocultara tras la etiqueta de locura. El fiscal de distrito Michael McCann adoptó una postura firme. Dahmer estaba enfermo, sí, pero no lo suficientemente enfermo como para no entender lo que estaba haciendo. McCann lo describió como calculador, metódico y plenamente consciente de que sus acciones eran ilegales, inmorales y atroces. Argumento que el mero hecho de que Dahmer planificara sus ataques, drogara a sus víctimas, y ocultara cuerpos, demostraba una comprensión completa del bien y del mal. Según McCann, la locura de Dahmer no era legal sino moral. La sala del tribunal se convirtió en un campo de batalla entre psiquiatras. Los expertos de la defensa pintaron la mente de Dahmer como un pozo sin fondo de impulsos enfermos, compulsions incontrolables, y fantasías psicosexuales que gobernaban su comportamiento. Dijeron que Dahmer no buscaba matar por placer, sino para cumplir una fantasía que, en su mente distorsionada, parecía lógica, quería posesionarse completamente, para siempre. Y esa fijación, según la defensa, era una clara señal de psicosis. Por otro lado, los psiquiatras de la fiscalía testificaron que Dahmer era perfectamente capaz de controlar sus impulsos. Enfatizaron su comportamiento organizado y su capacidad para mantener una doble vida. Explicaron que las parafilias extremas no equivalen a una psicosis que incapacite el juicio moral. Dahmer tenía fantasías enfermas, sí, pero actuaba sobre ellas con lógica depredadora, no con un delirio incontrolado. A lo largo del juicio, el público asuco relatos escalofriantes. Las pruebas fotográficas, los informes forenses, las descripciones de los cuerpos. Era un desfile constante de dolor y horror. Las familias de las víctimas presentes todos los días experimentaron el juicio como una segunda tragedia. Y fue precisamente una de esas familias la que tuvo uno de los momentos más recordados del juicio. Rita Isbell, hermana de Errol Lindsay, se levantó durante su testimonio. Se lanzó hacia Dahmer entre lágrimas y gritos. Y tuvo que ser contenida por varios oficiales. Su dolor, su rabia y su impotencia quedaron grabados para siempre en la memoria colectiva. Fue la expresión más cruda del sufrimiento que Dahmer había causado. Tracy Edwards también testificó. El hombre cuya escape condujo finalmente a la captura del asesino. Su relato fue devastador. Explicó claramente cómo Dahmer lo había sedado, manipulado y encadenado. Cómo había intentado fotografiarlo y someterlo. Describió los movimientos calculados de Dahmer, su tono frío, su control constante. Su testimonio destruyó la idea de que Dahmer actuó bajo un estado mental debilitado. Mostró a un hombre que sabía perfectamente lo que estaba haciendo y cómo mantener un control absoluto. Después de semanas de testimonio, el jurado recibió la instrucción más difícil de sus vidas. Determinar si Dahmer podía, en el momento de sus crímenes, apreciar la criminalidad de su conducta. No se trataba de si estaba enfermo. Se trataba de si sabía que estaba haciendo algo malo. Era una cuestión de responsabilidad moral y legal. Una línea delgada y compleja que separa la enfermedad mental de la plena culpabilidad. El 15 de febrero de 1992, se anunció el veredicto. Jeffrey Dahmer fue declarado cuerdo y, por lo tanto, culpable de 15 cargos de asesinato. Los jurados concluyeron que Dahmer, aunque profundamente perturbado, había actuado con intención, conciencia y frialdad. Sabía que lo que estaba haciendo era criminal. Sabía que tenía que esconderlo. Y esa conciencia lo hizo responsable. El juez impuso 15 cadenas perpetuas consecutivas. Más de 900 años en prisión. Sin posibilidad de libertad condicional. Sin oportunidad de redención. Con esa sentencia, la justicia humana hizo lo único que podía hacer. Eliminar permanentemente al monstruo de Milwaukee del mundo. Y poner fin al capítulo legal de uno de los casos más horripilantes with his life sentence, offered a legal closure, but failed to heal the deep wound that the case exposed. The Dahmer case did not simply end with a verdict. It became a vast mirror where society saw reflected its failures, prejudices, and omissions. It was much more than the story of a murderer. It was the exposure of an outstanding social debt, a reminder that justice does not always act when it should, and that sometimes institutions fail precisely those they are meant to protect. The darkest legacy of the case concerns police negligence and racial prejudice. After Dahmer's arrest, the Milwaukee Police Department was forced to examine its own failures. The internal report was damning. Officers John Balcerzik and Joseph Gabrish, the same officers who returned Canaric synthasymphone to his murderer, had acted with unjustifiable indifference. The Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission concluded that the officers ignored evident signs of danger, dismissed testimonies from African American women, and uncritically accepted a white man's word over that of racialized victims. The conclusion was unequivocal. Homophobia and racism had influenced the police decision. As a result, both officers were fired. For the minority community in Milwaukee, that report was not a surprise, but the public confirmation of what they had been denouncing for years, that their lives were treated as less valuable, that the police did not listen to them, and that the system did not act when the victims were racialized individuals, migrants, or gay men. The death of Canaric was more than a tragedy. It was evidence of a system that looked the other way. This sparked a wave of protests that swept the city. Civil rights groups, community organizations, and outraged citizens demanded the resignation of the police chief. The anger was so intense that for the first time in decades, public pressure succeeded in pushing for structural reforms within the Milwaukee Police Department. Mandatory non-discrimination policies, training on racial and sexual diversity, and more rigorous protocols for assessing potential abuse situations were implemented. But still, for the victims' families, those reforms came too late. Knowing that Conrac's death could have been prevented added a level of pain that was impossible to describe. As the city sought to rebuild, Jeffrey Dahmer's life in prison became the last unsettling chapter of this story. He was serving his sentence at the Columbia Correctional Institution, where, after an initial period of isolation, he was integrated into common tasks within the prison. Dahmer seemed to accept his fate with disconcerting coldness. However, the prison environment was charged with resentment towards him. His notoriety, public repulsion, and the nature of his crimes made many inmates view him as a target. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked while cleaning alongside two other inmates. One of them, Christopher Scarver, an inmate suffering from schizophrenia who claimed to have acted for religious reasons, took a metal bar and beat Dahmer to death. Scarver also attacked another inmate during the same incident. Dahmer died that morning without the possibility of appeal, without the opportunity to publicly reflect on his crimes, and without seeing his victims gain further answers. His violent death closed his story forever, though it left many other wounds open. Apartment 213, the epicenter of horror, also had a swift end. In 1992, just 15 months after his arrest, the building was demolished thanks to a coalition of community leaders seeking to eliminate any physical trace of the trauma. The lot was left empty, turned into a silent space that represented both an attempt at symbolic cleansing and the impossibility of completely erasing what had happened. The physical void became a reflection of the emotional void left in families, in the community, and in collective memory. In retrospect, the Dahmer case is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is a painful lesson about the human condition, about how a predator can go unnoticed in the loneliness of a modern city, and about how institutional indifference can cost lives. Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy includes the shame of a city, the rage of a community, and the outstanding debt to the victims who never received the protection they deserved. Dahmer was individually punished, but social justice for those who died and those who survived remains a struggle that continues long after his death.
If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, activate the little bell, and give it a like. This way, you will help more people discover the story behind every mystery.
We have reached the end of this heart-wrenching journey through the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer. A case that, beyond the brutality of his crimes, forces us to confront the dark side of social neglect. The Milwaukee monster, condemned to the perpetual loneliness of prison, closed his chapter of terror. But not before exposing the painful truth. That the system repeatedly failed, and that prejudice and indifference were silent accomplices in the death of 17 young people. The demolition of Apartment 213 could not erase the debt that the city of Milwaukee incurred with the victims and their families. A trauma that remains latent in historical memory. This case leaves us with an uncomfortable question. How easy is it for a predator to thrive when certain lives are considered expendable? We close the curtain on Dahmer's calculated horror to move to a completely different darkness. From deep and lonely America, we travel to the vibrant and classist Madrid of 1888. We leave behind serial madness to delve into a mystery wrapped in bedroom secrets, class disputes, and a riddle so dense that the press dubbed it the double lie crime. In our next episode, we will dive into the crime on Fuencarral Street. The victim, Luciana Borges, and her maid, Juana. A high society woman found murdered in her bed while the house was ablaze. The fire, just like an Alcázar, was used to erase the scene. But this fire was not accidental. The police soon found themselves facing a labyrinth of accusations pointing to the victim's maid, Manuela Yanez. A young woman of humble origins whose testimony was so contradictory and filled with desperation that investigators could not trust a word she said. But the Fuencarral case is much more than the story of a lady and her maid. It is a chronicle that divided Spanish society, revealing the class tensions of the time. Was the crime committed by the maid in a fit of jealousy or greed? Or was it orchestrated by powerful third parties to cover up an unspeakable family secret? Using the humble young woman as a scapegoat, we will focus on the trial that polarized the nation. The intrusion of yellow journalism that glorified the morbid. and the final riddle of the double lie. Get ready for an immersion into the Black Chronicle of 19th century Madrid, where appearances deceive and the truth is hidden behind high society and smoke. Don't miss the next episode, where we will unearth the secrets of the crime on Fuencarral Street.